It is not just a shipwreck. It is a question that has never been answered. How could a vital national lifeline, advertised as the invincible pride of the Senegalese Navy, collapse into the silence of the Atlantic in less than 5 minutes? Why did a system designed to defy the crushing power of the ocean surrender to a simple shift in the rain? And more importantly, why did nearly 2,000 students, merchants, and families become the first victims of the very confidence they trusted? But that is only the surface. Behind the moment the massive steel hull inverted in the darkness lies another story less told, but equally dangerous, about systemic negligence, calculating greed, and a chain of small errors merging into history. Why did it all happen in September 2002? And what actually killed the MV Le Joola? The wind, the waves, or the weight of a crowd that should never have been there? Stay tuned. Because the truth about the Joola is unlike any story you know. The afternoon of September 26, 2002 did not taste like tragedy. It tasted of roasted peanuts, sea salt, and the sweet, heavy humidity of the Casamance region. In the port of Ziguinchor, the sun beat down on the water with a golden, lazy intensity. For the people of southern Senegal, the Le Joola was more than a ferry. It was a lifeline. It was a floating bridge of steel that connected the isolated south to the heartbeat of Dakar in the north, bypassing the dangerous roads and the border checkpoints of the Gambia. On this day, the mood was electric. Schools were reopening in Dakar, and the decks were flooded with university students, bright-eyed and carrying their futures in worn backpacks. There were market women with baskets of mangoes and red palm oil families returning from holidays, and musicians tuning their kora harps. The air buzzed with Wolof French and laughter. It was a festival of motion. To step onto the Le Joola was to step into a promise of modernity. The ship, German-built and painted a pristine white, looked invincible against the muddy river water. Inside, the ventilation hummed a cool lullaby, and the smell of diesel was masked by the scent of cheap perfume and expensive tobacco. The passengers felt the solid steel under their feet and believed in the permanence of the machine. But as the band began to play in the second-class cabin, the music vibrated through a hull that was already groaning under a weight it was never designed to hold. The math of the disaster began at the ticket booth. The ship was certified for 580 souls. It was a strict engineering limit calculated to keep the vessel buoyant and stable. But demand was a river that refused to be dammed. Tickets were sold, then sold again. Children were squeezed onto laps. Cousins were waved through gates. By late afternoon, the manifest listed roughly 1,000 names. In reality, nearly 2,000 human beings were packed into every corner, corridor, and deck. The ship sat low in the water, heavy and lethargic. The officers on the bridge noticed the anomaly even tied to the dock. The horizon line through the window was crooked. The ship was already listing to the port side, pulled down by an invisible anchor of human mass. Yet the routine continued. The crew, trusting the calm river, adjusted the ballast tanks, pumping water to the opposite side to artificially force the ship straight. It was a cosmetic fix for a structural crisis. The list vanished, or so it seemed. The Le Joola pushed off the dock, churning the Casamance River into white foam, heading toward the open Atlantic. As twilight fell, the atmosphere on board shifted from chaotic to hypnotic. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of violet and orange. The electric lights of the ship flickered on, turning the Le Joola into a glittering jewel moving through the black void. In the restaurant, passengers dined on steak and rice. On the upper deck, a dance band played mbalax rhythms, the drums syncing with the hearts of the students dancing under the stars. The breeze was cool, a welcome relief from the heat of the day. Inside the cabins, mothers tucked babies into bunks, the gentle rocking of the ocean acting as a cradle. It was a scene of perfect civilized order. The engines thrummed with a steady, reassuring rhythm, a mechanical heartbeat that whispered, "You are safe. You are going home." They did not feel the change in the floor beneath them, but the ship was now a pendulum waiting for a push. The center of gravity had risen dangerously high, hovering like a ghost above the waterline. The captain, an experienced seaman, navigated the vessel out of the river mouth and into the deep ocean. The forecast called for rain typical for the season, but nothing the German steel couldn't handle. The ship cut through the waves with arrogance. The passengers were happy. They were dancing on the ceiling of a tomb surrounded by the infinite indifference of the Atlantic. The golden dream was complete. 10:55 p.m. The Atlantic is no longer a canvas. It is a wall. The storm does not announce itself with thunder. It arrives as a solid sheet of water sweeping in from the dark horizon of the Gambia. The wind speeds spike to 50 knots. The waves, previously rhythmic and polite, turn jagged and confused. On the upper deck, the party dies instantly. The mbalax music stops, replaced by the roar of the squall. The rain is torrential, stinging the skin like gravel. It is not just wet. It is cold, a sudden atmospheric shock that triggers a primal instinct in the crowd. As a young man covers his head with a newspaper to stay dry, the physics of the ship enter a terminal equation. Hundreds of passengers on the open top deck react as one organism. They do not think. They move. Seeking shelter from the lashing rain coming from the starboard side, they rush en masse to the port side, the leeward side. This is the moment the machine loses the war. The Le Joola is top-heavy, burdened by the unrecorded weight of the extra 1,000 souls. As this massive biological cargo shifts 10 meters to the left, the ship's center of gravity snaps violently out of alignment. The vessel leans. It does not roll with the wave and return. It leans and it stays. Inside the second-class cabin, the illusion of safety shatters. Dinner plates slide off tables, crashing into the bulkheads. Chairs skid across the linoleum. The angle is wrong. It is too steep. A bottle of perfume rolls off a vanity shelf, falling not down, but sideways, hitting the wall. The lights flicker once. A mother gripping her child's hand smiles nervously, waiting for the ship to right itself, unaware that the ocean is already pouring into the open car deck below. For a heartbeat, there is a pause. The ship hangs suspended at a sickening 30-degree angle. This is the false hope. In the bridge, the captain shouts orders to correct the helm to turn into the wind. The passengers grab onto railings, bunk beds, and each other thinking, this is just a bad roll. They believe the steel will fight back. But the steel has no fight left. The cargo on the vehicle deck trucks, cars, crates breaks its chains. The sound is deafening, tons of metal slamming against the port hull, adding a hammer blow to the list. Gravity takes full command. The angle deepens. 40 degrees, 60 degrees. The world tilts on its axis. The floor becomes a wall. The wall becomes a ceiling. Panic erupts. It is not a scream. It is a collective frequency of terror that vibrates through the hull. In the cabin's doors jam shut as the frames warp under the stress. Sleepers wake up falling, tumbling out of bunks into a chaotic pile of luggage and bodies. The ocean breaches the windows. Glass explodes inward. The water does not flow. It punches. It rushes into the corridors, cold and heavy, hunting for air. The sound is a roar. The displacement of atmosphere. The crushing of partitions. The drowning of the generators. Total darkness swallows the ship. A student manages to climb out of a window, gasping for air, only to look up and see the massive steel keel of the ship rising above him like a falling moon. The Le Joola does not sink like the Titanic. It performs a somersault. It flips completely upside down. The capsize takes less than 5 minutes. Everything that was up is now down. The antennae point to the abyss. The keel points to the storm. Inside the inverted hull, chaos turns into a terrifying compression. The air rushes to the top, which is now the bottom of the ship, forming pockets of high pressure. People are thrown into the ceiling, which is now the floor. The water rises from below, compressing the survivors into smaller and smaller spaces. The screaming inside the hull is muffled by the steel, turning into a dull, rhythmic thumping. Outside, the storm rages on, indifferent to the new geometry. The massive white belly of the ship bobs in the waves slick with rain. The propellers spin lazily in the empty air, slowing to a halt. Then silence. The lights are gone. The music is gone. The heat of the engines is replaced by the freezing shock of the Atlantic. The Golden Dream is now a steel coffin floating upside down in the black water. When the sun rose on September 27th, it illuminated a scene that defied nautical logic. The Atlantic, now glassy and calm, held a single grotesque monument to the night's violence. The Le Joola was not gone. It was floating upside down, its massive red anti-fouling paint exposed to the sky like the belly of a dead whale. To the local fishermen, who arrived first in their wooden pirogues, the ship was a silent island. But as they killed their outboard motors and drifted closer, the silence broke. It was not the sound of wind. It was a rhythmic, desperate percussion. From inside the steel hull, hundreds of people were hammering against the plates. This was the terrifying physics of the air pocket. When the ship inverted, it trapped a massive bubble of atmosphere inside the passenger decks. The Le Joola had become a diving bell. Inside, in the pitch, black survivors were treading water in the inverted cafeteria and cabins breathing the compressed air, waiting for a rescue that they assumed was minutes away. They were alive. They were inches from the surface. But they were separated from the sun by 20 millimeters of German steel. This is where the story shifts from tragedy to betrayal. The fishermen, lacking heavy equipment, could only circle the hull, weeping as they listened to the screams muffled by the metal. They radioed for help at 7:00 a.m. They waited. The timeline of the response remains one of the most controversial chapters in maritime history. While the Titanic had the Carpathia racing through ice fields within hours, the Le Joola had silence. The Senegalese military protocol, rigid and paralyzed by a lack of information, did not mobilize a full-scale rescue fleet immediately. It took until late afternoon, nearly 19 hours after the capsize, for the official Navy rescue teams to arrive in force. By then, the hammering had changed. It was slower, fainter. The clock on the wall of history had stopped, but inside the hull, the chemistry of survival was running out. The air pockets were not infinite. As the survivors breathed, they consumed the oxygen and exhaled carbon dioxide. The water level inside rose slowly as the air pressure equalized. The sanctuary became a gas chamber. When the military divers finally entered the water, they faced an engineering nightmare. They could not simply cut a hole in the hull to let people out. The physics were cruel. The trapped air was the only thing keeping the ship afloat. Puncturing the hull would release the buoyancy bubble, sending the Le Joola and everyone inside it straight to the bottom of the ocean. The rescuers were forced to work through the submerged windows and doors, navigating a labyrinth of debris in zero visibility. What they found inside was a frozen tableau of panic. The corridors were choked with luggage mattresses and bodies. The water was thick with diesel fuel. The divers reported seeing hands reaching out from the darkness, gripping door frames in a final rigor mortis of escape. Only 64 people were pulled from the water alive. Most had escaped in the first few minutes, swimming out of windows before the ship fully settled. Of the hundreds trapped in the air pockets, almost none survived the long wait. The resurrection came not for the people, but for the truth. In the weeks that followed, the investigation became an autopsy of a nation's infrastructure. The salvage operation was a grim harvest. As cranes attempted to stabilize the vessel, the sheer scale of the deception was revealed. The divers recovered the manifest, but it was a lie. It listed 580 passengers. The body count told a different story. As the recovery teams worked, the number kept climbing. 800, 200, 500. The final estimate stood at 863 dead. Engineers reconstructed the disaster in simulation tanks. They proved that the Le Joola was doomed long before the rain started. The ship had been modified over the years. Extra decks added heavy equipment installed, raising its center of gravity. But the smoking gun was the stability curve. A healthy ship resists rolling. When a wave pushes it, it pushes back. The Le Joola, overloaded by 3 times its capacity, had zero positive stability at the moment of the crowd shift. It didn't just tip, it surrendered. The investigation revealed that one of the ship's 2 engines had been out of service. The ferry was limping on half power, unable to maneuver effectively against the wind. The life rafts were bolted down or inoperable. The crew, untrained for a capsize, had perished with the passengers. The most haunting artifact recovered was not a black box, but a simple wristwatch found on a wrist in the water. It had stopped at 11:05 p.m. It froze the exact moment a generation was erased. The students, the merchants, the mothers, they were not victims of a storm. They were victims of the normalization of deviance, the slow, creeping acceptance of risk until the gamble finally failed. The ship was eventually towed out to sea and allowed to sink, becoming an underwater grave. The ocean reclaimed the steel, but the silence of the delay hangs over the coastline to this day. The Atlantic does not keep monuments, it only keeps secrets. Today, there is no marker where the Le Joola went down. The coordinates 13 north, 16 west look exactly like the rest of the ocean, vast, blue, and indifferent. The water has washed away the diesel, the luggage, and the panic. But the echo of that night remains deafening. The loss of the Le Joola was not just a maritime disaster, it was a demographic amputation. In a nation of tight-knit communities, the death of nearly 2,000 people tore a hole in the social fabric of Senegal that has never fully healed. An entire generation of students, the future engineers, doctors, and artists of the Casamance, was extinguished in 5 minutes of darkness. Historians call it the Titanic of Africa, yet the world barely remembers its name, perhaps because it happened far from the cameras of the West, or perhaps because the cause was not an iceberg, but something far more common and terrifying, the belief that rules are flexible. The tragedy stands as a brutal permanent warning to the modern world. It reminds us that safety regulations are not bureaucratic red tape. They are written in blood. Every maximum capacity sign, every stability test, every load limit is a tombstone for someone who died, proving why it exists. The Le Joola taught us that nature is not malicious, but it is unforgiving. It does not care about our schedules, our politics, or our need to get home. It only respects physics. When we push machines beyond their limits, when we trade safety for profit, And when we ignore the small warnings in the pursuit of the golden dream, we are not gambling. We are simply waiting for the bill to arrive. And on the ocean, the bill is always paid in full. History is not just dates and numbers. It is the collective memory of our species. Thank you for taking the time to remember these events with us. If you have a story or an event you believe deserves to be told, leave it in the comments. We are listening.